Have you ever wondered what would happen if everything you thought you knew about faith, about reality, about the very nature of existence, was turned upside down in a single night? Michael Stevens thought he understood the boundaries of his world until something descended from the darkness above his remote Montana ranch. What this being revealed about Jesus Christ would challenge everything he believed and leave him questioning the very fabric of reality itself. The encounter lasted only minutes, but those minutes would reshape Michael's understanding of divine truth in ways that still send tremors through his soul. This is not a story about science fiction or fantasy. This is about a man who came face to face with something that spoke with authority about the most sacred name in human history, and what it revealed will shake you to your core. To continue discovering the profound truths that emerged from this impossible encounter, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. If you're ready to explore the deeper mysteries that connect our world to realms beyond our understanding, check out our comprehensive guide in the description below. Now, let's dive into what happened that night in Montana. The October wind cut through the valley like a blade, carrying with it the kind of silence that makes you question whether you're truly alone. Michael Stevens had lived on his family's ranch for 37 years, and he knew every sound the land could make. The cattle settling for the night, the barn door creaking on its hinges, the distant howl of coyotes echoing off the canyon walls. But on this particular evening, the silence felt different. It felt expectant. Michael was not a man given to flights of fancy. His life revolved around practical matters: feed schedules, veterinary visits, equipment maintenance, the endless cycle of ranch work that kept him grounded in tangible reality. His faith, too, was practical. Sunday services at the small Baptist church in town, grace before meals, prayers for good weather and healthy livestock. Simple, straightforward belief in a God who watched over hard-working people. That evening found him in the south pasture, checking on a pregnant mare who had been showing signs of distress. The veterinarian had visited earlier that day and pronounced everything normal, but Michael's instincts told him otherwise. He had learned to trust those instincts over 3 decades of working with animals. Something was wrong, and he intended to stay close until he was certain the mare would be all right. The stars above Montana ranch country burn with an intensity that city dwellers never experience. Light pollution doesn't exist out here, and on clear nights like this one, the Milky Way stretches across the sky like a river of diamonds. Michael had always found comfort in that vast display, a reminder of the majesty of creation. But as he stood beside the fence, watching his mare pace restlessly in the moonlight, something caught his attention that didn't belong among the familiar constellations. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than an unusually bright star, positioned low on the horizon. But stars don't move, and this light was definitely moving. Not with the steady progression of an airplane or the predictable arc of a satellite. This light moved with purpose, changing direction in ways that defied conventional aircraft capabilities. Michael found himself transfixed, his concern for the mare temporarily forgotten as he tracked this impossible object across the night sky. The light grew brighter as it approached, and Michael's rational mind began cycling through explanations. Military aircraft, perhaps. The government conducted all sorts of classified testing in remote areas. Or maybe atmospheric phenomena, some kind of unusual reflection or weather-related optical illusion. He had read about such things happening, especially in regions with specific geological formations. But as the light descended lower, hovering perhaps 100 feet above his pasture, Michael's comfortable explanations began to crumble. No aircraft he knew of could maintain such a stationary position without the telltale sound of rotors or engines. The silence remained absolute, broken only by the nervous whinnying of his mare, who had noticed the unusual visitor and was clearly agitated by its presence. The light pulsed, shifting from brilliant white to softer blue, then to a warm golden hue that seemed to radiate peace rather than the harsh intensity he had initially observed. Michael felt his heartbeat slow, his breathing deepen. Whatever fear he might have experienced was being replaced by something else entirely. Not calmness exactly, but a profound sense of being in the presence of something significant, something that demanded attention and respect. He found himself walking toward the center of the pasture, drawn by an impulse he couldn't name or resist. Each step felt deliberate, as if he were participating in something that had been planned long before this moment. The rational part of his mind screamed warnings, urged him to retreat to the safety of his house, to call the authorities, to do anything except approach this impossible thing hovering above his land. But Michael kept walking because something deeper than rational thought was guiding him now. Something that recognized this encounter as necessary, as meant to be. His boots crunched softly on the frost-covered grass, and with each step he felt as though he were crossing not just physical distance, but some invisible threshold into territory he had never imagined existed. The light began to descend further, and as it did, Michael could make out a form within its radiance. Not a craft in the traditional sense, but a presence, a being of some kind that existed within or as part of the luminous display. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his feet continued forward, carrying him toward an appointment he hadn't known he had made. When the presence spoke, it wasn't through sound waves that traveled to his ears. The communication came directly into his consciousness, bypassing the normal channels of hearing and speaking straight to his understanding. The voice, if it could be called that, carried weight and authority, but also an unmistakable gentleness. Michael Stevens, the presence communicated, and hearing his name spoken by this impossible being sent electricity through every nerve in his body. You have been seeking answers to questions you haven't yet learned how to ask. Michael's mouth opened, but no words emerged. How do you respond to something that shouldn't exist? Speaking truths about your inner life that you've barely acknowledged to yourself. Because the presence was right. For months, maybe years, he had been wrestling with doubts and questions that seemed to have no acceptable outlets in his small community. Questions about the nature of God, about whether humanity was truly alone in the universe, about whether the teachings he had accepted all his life represented the complete picture of divine reality. I know you're confused, the presence continued, its communication filling Michael with understanding that transcended mere words. I know you've been praying for clarity, for some sign that your faith has room to grow beyond the boundaries you've been taught to accept. The being moved closer, and Michael could see that it possessed a form that was both humanoid and utterly otherworldly. Tall, luminescent, with features that seemed to shift between familiar and alien depending on the angle from which he observed them. But the eyes, those remained constant. They held depths of knowledge and compassion that made Michael feel simultaneously small and infinitely valuable. "What are you?" Michael finally managed to whisper, his voice barely audible in the crisp night air. "I am a messenger," came the reply, "sent by the one you call Jesus." Those words hit Michael like a physical blow. Jesus. The name that had shaped his entire worldview, that represented everything he believed about salvation and divine love. But Jesus sending otherworldly messengers? This was territory his Baptist upbringing had never prepared him to navigate. "That's impossible," Michael said, though even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't true. He was standing in his own pasture, conversing with a being of light who had descended from the heavens. Impossible had clearly become possible, whether his theology had room for it or not. The presence seemed to smile, though its features were too fluid for Michael to be certain. Your Christ is not limited to the understanding of any single world or any single people, Michael. The love that incarnated in Jesus of Nazareth extends throughout all creation, across distances and realities that your human mind cannot yet comprehend. Michael felt his knees grow weak. Everything he thought he knew about his faith, about the exclusive nature of Christ's mission to earth, about humanity's unique place in God's plan, was being challenged by someone claiming to speak with divine authority. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice cracking with the weight of implications he was only beginning to grasp. "Because you are ready to hear it," the messenger replied. "Because your heart has been prepared through years of questions and seeking. Because the time has come for humanity to understand that God's love is not confined to the boundaries of your world." The golden light pulsed brighter, and Michael felt warmth spreading through his chest, a sensation of being known and accepted that surpassed anything he had experienced in decades of religious observance. This wasn't the distant, stern deity of his childhood Sunday school lessons. This was intimate, personal, overwhelmingly present. "The Jesus you worship," the messenger continued, "walked among you as a human being, yes, but his consciousness, his divine nature, extends far beyond the historical figure you remember. He is active throughout creation, guiding and teaching countless children of God across the universe." Michael's mind reeled. Multiple worlds. Other children of God, Christ's mission extending beyond earth. These concepts exploded through his consciousness like fireworks, illuminating vast territories of possibility he had never imagined. But with that illumination came fear. If this was true, what did it mean for everything he had believed about salvation, about humanity's special relationship with God, about the exclusivity of Christian faith? Were the foundations of his spiritual life crumbling beneath him, or were they simply expanding beyond recognition? The messenger seemed to sense his turmoil, and the golden light softened to an even gentler hue. "Your fear is understandable, Michael, but consider this. Does a parent love only one child? Does the sun shine only on one garden? The divine love you have experienced through Christ is not diminished by its presence elsewhere. Rather, it is magnified." Michael struggled to process these concepts that challenged everything he had been taught about the uniqueness of Earth's relationship with God. His hands trembled as he gripped the fence post behind him, needing something solid to anchor himself in this reality that was rapidly becoming unrecognizable. "But the Bible says," he began, then stopped. What did the Bible say about other worlds? About Christ's mission extending beyond Earth? He realized that many of his assumptions about exclusivity had come not from Scripture itself, but from interpretations he had never questioned. "Your sacred texts contain truths that your people have not yet fully understood," the messenger communicated. "When Christ spoke of having other sheep not of this fold, what did you think he meant? When he described his Father's house as having many rooms, did you imagine they were all on this single world?" The words struck Michael like lightning, illuminating a landscape he had never seen clearly before. Passages he had read countless times suddenly took on new dimensions, new possibilities. Had he been reading his own Bible through unnecessarily narrow interpretations? "I've spent my whole life believing that humanity was God's only creation capable of relationship with Him," Michael said, his voice barely a whisper. "That earth was the center of everything divine, and you are precious to the Creator, Michael. Every soul on your world is treasured beyond measure. But the universe is vast, and love this profound cannot be contained within the boundaries of a single planet. Christ's sacrifice was cosmic in scope, affecting realities you cannot yet imagine. Michael felt something inside him breaking open, not in destruction, but in expansion, like a seed pod splitting to release new growth. The small, contained version of faith he had carried was being replaced by something immense and overwhelming. "How many worlds?" he asked, hardly believing he was asking such a question. "More than the stars you can see on the clearest night," came the reply. "Countless civilizations, each discovering divine love in ways appropriate to their nature and development. Some, like yours, through incarnation and sacrifice. Others, through different expressions of the same eternal truth." The implications crashed over Michael in waves. Billions of worlds, countless beings experiencing God's love. Christ active throughout creation in ways that dwarfed anything he had imagined. His small Baptist church suddenly seemed like a single candle in an infinite cathedral of light. "Why me?" he asked again, more urgently now. "Why are you telling me this?" "I'm nobody special. Just a rancher in Montana." The messenger moved closer, and Michael could feel the immense compassion radiating from its presence. "You are chosen not because of your position or education or influence, but because of your heart. You have been seeking truth with sincere hunger. You have been prepared through years of questions that others in your community were afraid to ask." Michael thought about the countless nights he had stood in his pastures, looking up at the stars and wondering if God's creation extended beyond what he could see. The doubts he had never voiced aloud about whether humanity could possibly be alone in such a vast universe. The growing sense that the God he worshipped must be greater than any human theology could contain. "What am I supposed to do with this knowledge?" he asked, feeling the weight of cosmic revelation settling on his shoulders. "Live it?" the messenger replied simply. "Let it transform your understanding of divine love. Share it when others are ready to hear, but do not force it upon those whose time has not yet come. The truth spreads like seeds on fertile ground. Plant wisely." Michael felt tears streaming down his face, though he hadn't realized he was crying. The emotion was too vast for his body to contain. Wonder, fear, gratitude, and overwhelming love all swirled together in his chest until he thought his heart might burst from the intensity. "Will I see you again?" he asked, sensing somehow that this encounter was drawing to a close. "When you need to," the messenger replied. "But remember, Michael, you are never alone. The presence of Christ extends throughout all creation, including the space around you right now. You have always been surrounded by love too great for human comprehension." The golden light began to intensify, and Michael had to shield his eyes. When he could look again, the presence was ascending, moving back toward the star-filled sky with the same purposeful grace with which it had arrived. "Remember," the voice echoed in his mind as the light grew distant, "the gospel is not just for your world. It is the cosmic story of divine love reaching across all barriers to reclaim every lost child. Your faith has not been diminished tonight. It has been set free." Michael stood alone in his pasture, the silence rushing back like a tide. But it was a different silence now, not empty, but full. Pregnant with possibilities he was only beginning to understand. Above him, the stars seemed brighter, more alive, each one a potential home for other children of God experiencing their own relationship with divine love. His mare had calmed during the encounter and now stood peacefully near the fence, as if she too had been touched by the presence that had visited them. Michael walked over and stroked her neck, marveling at how normal such a simple action felt after experiencing something that had shattered every assumption about reality he had ever held. The questions came flooding back as the immediate impact of the encounter began to settle. How could he return to his small church and pretend nothing had changed? How could he sit through sermons about humanity's unique place in creation when he now knew the truth was so much vaster? How could he explain to his neighbors and friends that everything they believed about God's love was true, but also infinitely larger than they had imagined? But underneath the questions, something else was growing, a peace he had never experienced before. The messenger had been right about one thing. His faith hadn't been destroyed tonight. It had been liberated from constraints he hadn't even realized were there. Michael looked up at the stars one more time before heading back to his house. Somewhere among those points of light, other beings were discovering the same divine love that had shaped his own life. Other worlds were experiencing their own versions of salvation, their own encounters with the cosmic Christ whose love transcended every boundary. The thought should have made him feel small and insignificant. Instead, it made him feel part of something magnificent beyond description. He was not just a rancher in Montana. He was a child of God in a universe teeming with divine love, connected to countless other souls across the cosmos who shared the same eternal destiny. As he walked back toward his house, Michael Stevens knew that his life had been divided into before and after. Before the night he learned that Christ's love extended throughout all creation, and after, when he would have to learn how to live with knowledge that would transform everything about his understanding of faith, purpose, and his place in God's infinite plan. The encounter was over, but its implications were just beginning to unfold, and somewhere in the depths of his transformed heart, Michael knew that this was only the beginning of a journey into truth that would challenge and expand his faith in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The weeks that followed Michael's encounter moved like a slow-motion avalanche of transformation. He tried to return to his normal routines, but everything felt different now. The morning chores, the afternoon repairs, the evening checks on his livestock. All of it continued as it always had, yet none of it felt the same. How could it, when every star he glimpsed reminded him of worlds beyond counting where other souls were walking their own paths toward divine truth? His first Sunday back at church proved more challenging than he had anticipated. Pastor Williams delivered a sermon about humanity's special covenant with God, about earth being the center of divine attention, about the exclusivity of salvation through Christ. Michael sat in his usual pew, third row from the back, and felt each familiar phrase land differently in his transformed consciousness. The words weren't wrong exactly. Christ was indeed the path to salvation. Divine love was indeed available through that sacred relationship. But the framework felt so small now, so unnecessarily confined, like trying to describe the ocean by examining a single drop of water. True, but woefully incomplete. After the service, Michael lingered in the parking lot, watching his neighbors and friends discuss the sermon with comfortable certainty. These were good people, faithful people who had supported him through difficult times and celebrated his joys. How could he possibly bridge the gap between their understanding and the cosmic reality that had been revealed to him? "Michael, you seem different lately," said Eleanor Hutchinson, the church organist who had known him since childhood. "Everything all right out at the ranch?" The question pierced deeper than she could have known. How did you explain to someone that everything was more than all right, that you had discovered the universe was more magnificent than you had ever dared imagine, without sounding like you had lost your mind? "Just been doing some thinking, Eleanor. You know how it is during the quiet seasons." She smiled and patted his arm. "Well, don't think too hard. Sometimes the simple truths are the best ones." Simple truths. Michael pondered those words as he drove the winding road back to his ranch. The truth he had encountered was simultaneously the simplest thing imaginable and the most complex. Love extending throughout creation. Christ active on countless worlds. Divine presence everywhere, always. Simple in its essence, staggering in its implications. Over the following days, Michael found himself drawn repeatedly to his Bible, reading familiar passages with new eyes. The Gospel of John became a revelation. In my Father's house are many rooms. How had he never wondered about the scope of those rooms? I have other sheep that are not of this fold. Other sheep, other worlds, other children of God discovering the same love through different expressions of divine grace. The book of Ezekiel took on new dimensions as well. The descriptions of beings with multiple faces, wheels within wheels, creatures that moved like lightning across the sky. Were these purely symbolic visions, or had the prophet been granted glimpses of realities that transcended earthly understanding? Michael found himself considering possibilities that would have seemed blasphemous just weeks earlier, but it was during his evening walks through the pastures that the deepest changes occurred. The silence that had once felt empty now thrummed with invisible presence. Not the dramatic golden light of that extraordinary night, but something subtler and more constant. An awareness of being surrounded by love too vast for human comprehension, connected to a network of consciousness that spanned the cosmos. One evening, as November's chill began to settle over the valley, Michael encountered something that tested his ability to process his expanding reality. He was checking the water troughs in the north pasture when he noticed one of his cattle behaving strangely. The heifer stood motionless, her head tilted upward, staring at a point in the sky where nothing visible appeared to be present. Michael followed her gaze and saw only stars. But as he watched, a subtle shift occurred in the quality of light above them. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would have been noticeable to casual observation. Just a gentle intensification of the starlight in a particular region of sky, as if something was passing between the earth and the celestial bodies beyond. The heifer remained transfixed for several minutes, then slowly lowered her head and resumed grazing as if nothing had happened. Michael stood in the darkness, wondering if he had witnessed another visitation, or if his heightened awareness was causing him to perceive ordinary events as extraordinary. The uncertainty troubled him less than he might have expected. The messenger had told him he would never be alone, that divine presence surrounded him constantly. Perhaps learning to recognize that presence was part of his transformation, part of growing into the expanded faith that had been awakened within him. His relationship with prayer began to evolve as well. The formal requests and structured gratitude of his traditional devotions gave way to something more like ongoing conversation, not the dramatic direct communication he had experienced during the encounter, but a sense of dialogue with a presence that was both intimately personal and cosmically vast. He found himself talking to God while repairing fence posts, sharing his confusion and wonder with the divine consciousness that he now understood to be active throughout creation. The responses came not as audible words, but as subtle shifts in understanding, gentle clarifications that emerged in his mind like flowers blooming and fast forward. One such moment of clarity came while he was reviewing his ranch's financial records. The numbers weren't encouraging. Feed costs had risen, cattle prices had dropped, and several unexpected veterinary bills had strained his budget. Under normal circumstances, this would have triggered anxiety about the future, worry about his ability to maintain the property that had been in his family for 3 generations. But as he sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by receipts and ledgers, a different perspective emerged. If divine love truly extended throughout all creation, if he was truly connected to a cosmic network of souls, all walking their paths toward the same ultimate truth, then his temporary financial struggles were part of a much larger pattern. Not meaningless suffering, but growth experiences designed to deepen his trust in divine provision. The insight didn't magically solve his money problems, but it transformed his relationship with them. Instead of viewing the challenges as evidence of divine abandonment or personal failure, he began to see them as opportunities to practice the kind of faith that extended beyond his immediate circumstances. This shift in perspective proved crucial when his neighbor, Tom Bradley, approached him about selling a portion of his land for development. A housing project was being planned for the valley, and several ranchers had already agreed to sell parcels of their property for substantial sums. "It's good money, Michael," Tom said as they stood by the fence line that separated their properties. "Enough to secure your future, and then some. This valley's changing whether we like it or not. Might as well benefit from it." Michael looked across the rolling hills where he had spent decades raising cattle, where he had experienced the most profound spiritual encounter of his life. The thought of bulldozers and construction crews disturbing this sacred space triggered something protective deep in his chest. But was that protection coming from genuine spiritual guidance or from simple attachment to familiar surroundings? The question required careful consideration. If divine love truly extended throughout creation, then God's presence wasn't confined to this particular piece of Montana landscape. The sacred could be found anywhere, experienced by anyone who was ready to receive it. Yet something in his heart insisted that this land held a special purpose in the unfolding of divine plan. Not because it was inherently more holy than other places, but because it had been prepared for a specific role in the expansion of human consciousness. The encounter he had experienced was meant to be shared, somehow, some way, when the time was right. "I appreciate the offer, Tom," Michael finally said, "but I think I need to hold on to the land for now. There might be reasons I don't fully understand yet." Tom shrugged and headed back toward his truck. "Your call, neighbor, but don't wait too long. Opportunities like this don't come around often." As his neighbor drove away, Michael felt a subtle confirmation that his decision had been correct. Not because selling the land would have been morally wrong, but because keeping it aligned with a purpose that was still revealing itself. He was learning to trust the guidance that emerged from his transformed consciousness, even when it led him away from conventional wisdom. The first snow of the season arrived in late November, blanketing the valley in pristine white that reflected the starlight with crystalline clarity. Michael found himself spending more time outdoors during the long winter evenings, drawn by the enhanced beauty of the night sky and the sense of connection it fostered with the cosmic community he now knew existed beyond his perception. It was during one of these nocturnal walks that he encountered another test of his evolving faith. He had been following a fence line toward the south pasture when he noticed footprints in the fresh snow. Human footprints, but not his own. Someone had been walking on his property, following a path that led directly toward the location where his encounter with the messenger had taken place. Michael's first instinct was alarm. Trespassers could be dangerous, especially in remote areas where help was far away. But as he followed the tracks, a different possibility began to emerge. What if someone else had experienced something similar? What if the divine presence that had visited him was reaching out to other seeking souls? The footprints led to the exact spot where he had stood during his encounter with the golden light. There, in the center of what had become sacred ground in his personal geography, the tracks formed a circle, as if someone had stood there for an extended period, perhaps looking up at the same stars that had delivered such profound revelation. But there were no other signs of the visitor's presence, no disturbance of the fence, no evidence of vehicles or equipment, just the circular pattern of footprints in the snow, already being softened by fresh flakes that had begun to fall. Michael stood in the center of those mysterious tracks, looking up at the star-filled sky and feeling a deep sense of anticipation. His encounter had been the beginning of something larger, not an isolated event, but part of a pattern of awakening that was spreading through human consciousness. Others were being prepared, others were being called, Others were receiving their own revelations about the cosmic scope of divine love. The snow continued to fall as he made his way back to the house, covering the mysterious footprints and returning the landscape to its pristine state. But the knowledge remained. He was not the only one whose understanding was being transformed. Somewhere in the darkness, other souls were discovering that their faith was larger than they had ever imagined. That night, as he sat by his fireplace reading the Psalms, Michael came across a verse that seemed to speak directly to his situation. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. The words had always been beautiful to him, but now they carried weight that threatened to overwhelm his ability to contain the emotion they generated. The heavens. Not just the heaven of traditional theology, but the physical heavens that stretched across unimaginable distances, containing worlds beyond counting where other children of God were discovering their own relationships with divine love. The sky above proclaiming handiwork that extended far beyond anything human theology had yet grasped. Michael closed his Bible and stared into the flickering flames of his fireplace. The messenger had told him that his faith had not been diminished, but set free. He was beginning to understand what that meant. The boundaries that had once seemed to define the limits of divine love were revealing themselves to be human constructions, necessary for a time but ultimately too small to contain the reality they attempted to describe. His faith was expanding, growing into something that could accommodate truths he had never imagined. And somehow, he sensed that this expansion was not unique to him. Across his world, other souls were undergoing similar transformations, preparing for a collective awakening that would revolutionize humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmic community of divine love. The fire crackled and settled, sending shadows dancing across the walls of the room where he had spent countless quiet evenings before his encounter with the impossible. But those shadows looked different now, full of movement and possibility rather than simple play of light and darkness. Everything looked different now because everything was different. Michael Stevens was no longer just a rancher in Montana. He was a bridge between worlds, a translator of cosmic truth for those who were ready to hear it. The transformation was far from complete, but its direction was clear. He was becoming something new, something necessary for the next phase of human spiritual evolution. And in the crackling of the fire and the whisper of snow against his windows, he could almost hear the voices of countless other souls across the universe, all walking their own paths toward the same magnificent truth. None of them alone. All of them connected. All of them loved beyond measure by a God whose plan was vast enough to encompass every star in the sky. The winter months that followed brought Michael face to face with the most challenging aspect of his transformation. It wasn't the cosmic implications that troubled him most, or even the difficulty of reconciling his expanded understanding with traditional doctrine. It was the growing awareness that he wasn't meant to carry this knowledge alone indefinitely. The messenger had spoken of sharing truth when others were ready to hear it. But how did you recognize readiness? How did you introduce concepts that seemed to violate everything your community had been taught about the nature of faith and reality? Michael found himself studying the people around him with new eyes, searching for signs that someone else might be asking the kinds of questions that had prepared him for revelation. His opportunity came from an unexpected source. Dr. Sarah Chen had moved to the valley 6 months earlier, taking over the veterinary practice when old Doc Morrison retired. She was efficient, knowledgeable, and refreshingly direct in her communications. But more importantly, she possessed a quality that Michael had learned to recognize as spiritual hunger. It manifested in small comments during her visits to treat his cattle. Observations about the vastness of the night sky in rural Montana. Questions about whether he ever felt overwhelmed by the scope of creation when he stood alone in his pastures. references to scientific discoveries that seemed to push the boundaries of conventional understanding. During a particularly difficult calving in February, as they worked together to deliver a breech calf, Sarah made a comment that caught Michael's attention like a fishhook snagging his consciousness. "Sometimes I wonder if we're arrogant to assume we're the only planet where life developed consciousness," she said, her hands working skillfully to reposition the struggling newborn. "The universe is so vast, so full of possibilities. It seems almost wasteful if all this complexity exists just for us." Michael felt his pulse quicken. Here was someone already questioning the boundaries that had once confined his own understanding. Someone whose scientific background might actually make her more open to expanded possibilities rather than less. "What do you think we'd find out there?" he asked carefully, testing the waters of her curiosity. "If we weren't alone, I mean." Sarah paused in her work, considering the question with the thoroughness he had come to expect from her. "I think we'd find that consciousness takes forms we can't imagine. That intelligence manifests in ways that don't match our assumptions. And maybe," she glanced at him with eyes that held depths of wondering he recognized from his own pre-encounter searching, "maybe we'd discover that whatever force created us created them too." The calf emerged successfully, taking its first shaky breaths in the cold barn air. But Michael barely noticed the successful delivery. His attention was focused entirely on the woman beside him, who had just articulated thoughts that paralleled his own journey of questioning. "That's an interesting perspective," he said, keeping his voice neutral despite the excitement building in his chest. Especially coming from someone with a scientific background. Sarah cleaned her hands methodically, her movements precise, but her expression thoughtful. "Science has taught me that the universe consistently surprises us. Every time we think we understand the limits of what's possible, we discover we were thinking too small. Dark matter, quantum entanglement, the possibility of multiple dimensions. Reality keeps revealing itself to be stranger and more wonderful than our theories predicted." Michael felt the familiar stirring that preceded divine guidance, the subtle shift in awareness that indicated he was approaching a moment of significance. This conversation wasn't happening by accident. Sarah's presence in his barn, her openness to possibilities beyond conventional boundaries, her scientific framework that might actually support rather than resist expanded truth. All of it felt orchestrated by the same intelligence that had sent the messenger to transform his understanding. "Would it change your faith?" he asked, surprising himself with his directness. "If we discovered we weren't alone? If consciousness existed throughout creation in ways we'd never imagined?" Sarah's hands stilled on the equipment she was packing. For a long moment, the only sounds in the barn were the soft breathing of cattle and the whisper of wind through gaps in the siding. When she finally looked at him, her eyes held a vulnerability that suggested his question had touched something deep. "I think it would expand my faith," she said quietly. "Make it bigger, more inclusive. If there's intelligence throughout the universe, if consciousness is a fundamental property of creation rather than a random accident, then whatever force is responsible for all of this must be more magnificent than any of our religions have imagined." Michael felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Here was someone not just ready to hear expanded truth, but already moving toward it through her own reasoning and observation. The divine timing of her presence in his life suddenly seemed obvious. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made her look at him more intently. "What would you say if I told you I'd had an experience that suggests your instincts are correct, that we're not alone, and that the intelligence behind creation is active throughout the universe in ways most people can't imagine?" She studied his face with the same careful attention she gave to diagnosing sick animals. Whatever she saw there must have convinced her of his sincerity, because her skeptical expression gradually shifted to curiosity. "I'd say I want to hear about it," she replied. "And I'd say that if anyone in this valley was going to have such an experience, it would be you." The comment caught him off guard. "Why me?" "Because you ask the right questions. Because you spend time alone under the stars thinking about things most people are too busy or too frightened to consider. Because there's something different about you, Michael. Something that suggests you're open to realities beyond the ordinary." Michael felt tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. To be seen, to be recognized as someone capable of receiving extraordinary truth, felt like validation he hadn't realized he needed. The isolation of carrying cosmic knowledge alone had been heavier than he had acknowledged. "It happened last October," he began, and then found himself telling her everything. The golden light descending into his pasture, the presence that communicated without words, the revelation about Christ's mission extending throughout creation, the cosmic scope of divine love that transcended any single world or people. Sarah listened without interruption, her scientific training allowing her to hear extraordinary claims without immediate dismissal. When he finished, she sat quietly for several minutes, processing what she had heard. "That's consistent with what quantum physics suggests about consciousness," she finally said. "That it might be a fundamental property of the universe rather than something that emerged accidentally from complex chemistry. And if consciousness is universal, then the possibility of other forms of intelligence becomes not just likely, but inevitable." Michael felt a rush of gratitude for her response. No accusations of delusion, no appeals to conventional religious doctrine, no attempts to explain away his experience through psychological mechanisms. Just thoughtful consideration of how his revelation might fit with expanding human knowledge. "How has it changed you?" she asked. "Living with that knowledge?" "It's made everything bigger," Michael said, echoing her earlier words. "My faith, my understanding of God's love, my sense of connection to creation. But it's also made me feel responsible in ways I'm still learning to understand." Sarah nodded slowly. "Responsible for what?" "For sharing it when the time is right. For helping others expand their understanding when they're ready. For being a bridge between the familiar and the impossible." "And you think I'm ready?" Michael looked at this woman who had listened to his impossible story with scientific curiosity rather than religious fear, who had already been questioning the boundaries that confined most people's understanding of reality. "I think you've been preparing yourself," he said. "Through your education, your observations, your willingness to consider possibilities that others might dismiss. I think you're exactly the kind of person who needs to know that their instincts about the vastness of creation are correct." Sarah stood and walked to the barn door, looking out at the star-filled sky that stretched endlessly above the valley. "If what you've told me is true," she said, "then everything changes. Not just for individuals, but for humanity as a whole. We're not isolated on a single planet waiting for distant salvation. We're part of a cosmic community of consciousness, all connected by the same divine love that created us." "Yes," Michael said simply. "That's exactly what it means." She turned back to face him, and he could see the transformation beginning in her eyes. The same expansion of possibility, the same overwhelming sense of connection to something vast and loving that he had experienced during his own encounter. "What do we do with this knowledge?" she asked. "We live it," Michael replied, remembering the messenger's words. "We let it transform our understanding of divine love. We share it when others show signs of readiness, and we trust that the same intelligence that revealed it to us will guide us in how to use it." Over the following weeks, Sarah became Michael's first student in the art of living with cosmic truth. She visited the ranch frequently, ostensibly to check on his cattle, but really to continue conversations that explored the implications of expanded faith. Together, they studied Scripture with new eyes, finding passages that suddenly revealed layers of meaning they had never noticed. "Look at this," Sarah said one evening, pointing to a verse in Ephesians. "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." Heavenly realms, plural, Michael noted. Multiple dimensions of reality, multiple levels of consciousness beyond what we normally perceive. "And here," Sarah continued, flipping to Colossians, "he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him." All things, Michael repeated, not just earthly things. All things throughout creation, visible and invisible. Thrones and powers and authorities that exist in realms we're only beginning to understand. Their studies revealed a pattern that both excited and humbled them. The biblical text, when read without the limiting assumptions they had inherited, actually supported the cosmic scope of divine love that had been revealed to Michael. The messenger hadn't contradicted Scripture, but had revealed dimensions of meaning that human theology had not yet grown large enough to contain. But their expanded understanding also brought challenges. Both of them struggled with how to relate to their traditional religious communities while honoring the truth they now carried. Sarah had begun attending Michael's small Baptist church, drawn by the need for fellowship even as she outgrew the confining interpretations she heard from the pulpit. "It's like being bilingual," she told Michael after a particularly difficult Sunday service. "I can understand what Pastor Williams is saying, and I can even appreciate the love and sincerity behind his words. But I'm also hearing meanings he doesn't intend, seeing possibilities he can't imagine." Michael knew exactly what she meant. The challenge wasn't that their traditional faith had been wrong, but that it had been incomplete. Like describing a symphony by examining a single note, or explaining an ocean by analyzing a cup of seawater. True, but woefully inadequate to contain the full reality. Their solution emerged gradually through prayer and careful discernment. Rather than abandoning their church community or forcing expanded truth on those who weren't ready to receive it, they would serve as bridges. Living examples of how faith could grow beyond traditional boundaries without losing its essential character. Quiet witnesses to the possibility that divine love was even greater than most people dared to believe. The approach required patience and wisdom. During Bible study sessions, they would ask gentle questions that encouraged others to consider broader interpretations. When conversations turned to the vastness of space or the possibility of life beyond Earth, they would share thoughtful perspectives that opened minds to larger possibilities without challenging beliefs directly. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, their influence began to spread. Other members of the congregation started asking deeper questions, exploring Scripture with more curiosity, expressing wonder about the scope of creation that surrounded them. Not dramatic conversions, but subtle shifts in consciousness that suggested seeds of expanded understanding were taking root. The most significant breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Eleanor Hutchinson, the elderly church organist who had known Michael since childhood, approached him after a Wednesday evening service with an expression of troubled curiosity. "Michael," she said, her voice carrying the uncertainty of someone venturing into unfamiliar territory, "I've been having the strangest dreams lately, about lights in the sky and voices telling me that God's love is bigger than I've understood. I know it sounds foolish, but they feel more real than most of my waking experiences. Michael felt his pulse quicken. Divine revelation manifesting through dreams, preparing another soul for expanded truth. The pattern was spreading, touching lives in ways that transcended his direct influence. Dreams can be powerful messengers, Eleanor, he said carefully. What do the voices tell you about God's love? She glanced around nervously as if afraid someone might overhear her speaking about such unconventional experiences. They say it extends throughout all creation, that there are other children of God in places we can't see, all connected by the same divine presence that loves us. They say our understanding has been too small, like trying to hold the ocean in a teacup. The metaphor was so similar to his own thinking that Michael wondered if the same intelligence that had sent his messenger was now reaching out to Eleanor through her dreams. The cosmic awakening wasn't limited to dramatic physical encounters but was manifesting through whatever channels individual souls were prepared to receive. "How do those dreams make you feel?" he asked. Eleanor's face softened, and for a moment she looked decades younger. "Overwhelmed with love," she whispered, "connected to something so vast and beautiful that it takes my breath away. Like I've been living in a tiny room my whole life and suddenly discovered there were infinite worlds beyond the door." Michael felt tears threatening again. Here was another soul discovering the magnificent scope of divine love. Another consciousness expanding to accommodate truth too large for conventional theology. The transformation he had experienced was not unique, but part of a pattern of awakening that was touching lives throughout his community. "Eleanor," he said gently, "I don't think your dreams are foolish at all. I think they're preparing you for a larger understanding of who you are and how much you're loved." Over the following months, similar conversations began happening with increasing frequency. Tom Bradley, his neighbor who had offered to buy his land, started talking about strange experiences while working alone in his fields. Pastor Williams himself began preaching sermons that emphasized the cosmic scope of divine love, though he seemed surprised by the expanded themes emerging from his preparation time. The awakening was spreading like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, touching lives in ways that suggested orchestration by an intelligence far greater than human planning could accomplish. Michael and Sarah found themselves serving as informal counselors for people experiencing their own encounters with expanded reality, helping them integrate impossible experiences with their traditional faith frameworks. But perhaps the most profound transformation was occurring within Michael himself. The isolated rancher who had once struggled with loneliness and financial uncertainty was discovering that his encounter with cosmic truth had prepared him for a role he had never imagined. He was becoming a teacher, a guide for souls ready to discover that their faith was larger than they had ever dared to believe. The messenger had been right. His faith had not been diminished, but set free, and in that freedom, he was finding purposes and connections that made his previous life seem like a shadow of what existence could become when aligned with divine truth that encompassed all creation. Michael Stevens stands in his Montana pasture tonight, no longer the isolated rancher who once questioned his place in an indifferent universe. He has become something far more significant, a bridge between worlds, a translator of cosmic truth, a living testament that divine love transcends every boundary we thought existed. The messenger's words echo through his transformed consciousness. Faith was not diminished that October night. It was liberated, set free from the constraints of human limitation to embrace a reality so vast, so magnificent, that it defies every assumption about our place in creation. What Michael discovered changes everything. Christ's love doesn't end at Earth's atmosphere. The gospel isn't confined to a single world. Divine presence permeates all existence, connecting countless souls across infinite realms in a cosmic community of consciousness that dwarfs our wildest imaginings. But here's what matters most. This revelation isn't reserved for isolated ranchers in Montana. The same awakening spreading through Michael's community, touching hearts through dreams and synchronicities, preparing minds for expanded truth, is happening everywhere. Souls across the planet are discovering that their faith has room to grow beyond anything they previously conceived. The footprints in the snow weren't from a single seeker. They represent multitudes ready to discover that divine love is bigger than any theology has yet contained, that we are not alone, that we have never been alone, that the God we worship operates on a scale that encompasses every star in the sky and every soul capable of receiving infinite love. Your questions about the vastness of creation, your sense that there must be more to existence than what you've been taught, your hunger for truth that transcends conventional boundaries. These aren't signs of weakening faith. They're evidence that your consciousness is expanding to accommodate cosmic reality. The universe is teeming with divine love, and you are an essential part of its magnificent unfolding. The same messenger who descended into a Montana pasture is reaching out through whatever channels your soul is prepared to receive. The awakening has begun, and it's spreading one transformed heart at a time. Are you ready to discover just how vast